It all began on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where every lawn looked perfectly trimmed, the mailboxes all matched, and the homeowners association patrolled the streets like watchful hawks. People moved here for the promise of order, safety, and community pride. But as anyone who has ever lived under an HOA knows, those same rules that keep things tidy can quickly turn into weapons when the wrong person decides to misuse them. For me, trouble started because of my dog. He was a 3-year-old golden retriever named Max, the friendliest and most harmless creature you could imagine. Max loved chasing tennis balls, wagging his tail at passing neighbors, and lying on the porch like he owned the place. He never barked excessively, never dug up yards, and certainly never caused harm. But apparently even Max wasn't safe from neighborhood politics. The complaint came in the form of a letter. It arrived in a crisp white HOA envelope, the kind everyone dreads seeing in their mailbox. Inside was a formal notice. Someone had reported that my dog was creating a disturbance in the neighborhood. The letter warned that if the issue continued, the HOA would consider fines and even further action regarding my right to keep Max in the community. At first I laughed. A disturbance? Max? The only disturbance he ever caused was wagging his tail so hard that it knocked things off the coffee table. But my amusement faded quickly when I realized that HOAs don't issue warnings lightly. Someone had specifically filed a complaint, and that meant one thing: someone wanted Max gone. I didn't have to guess for long. My next-door neighbor, Karen, had always had a problem with me. She was the kind of neighbor who measured grass with a ruler, who documented how long your trash can sat outside, who believed her position as HOA board member gave her authority over every single property on the block. To Karen, the neighborhood wasn't just where she lived. It was her kingdom, and she ruled it with a smug smile and a clipboard in hand. Karen never liked Max from the beginning. The day I moved in, Max trotted over to her yard to sniff at her flowers. He didn't dig, didn't damage anything, just sniffed. But Karen shrieked, as if he had trampled through her prized roses and made it clear, "Keep your dog off my lawn." From that moment forward, I knew she would be a problem. The letter from the HOA confirmed it. She had finally decided to escalate her dislike of Max into something official. I imagined her gleefully typing up the complaint, certain the HOA would side with her, certain she could bully me into giving up my beloved dog. But what Karen didn't know was that this time, her plan wouldn't go the way she expected. Because hidden behind her own pristine white fence and carefully manicured hedges was a secret that would soon come to light, one that would turn the entire neighborhood against her. For now, though, I was stuck staring at the letter, wondering what move she would make next. If Karen wanted a war over Max, I was ready to fight. But little did I know, the battle was only just beginning. After receiving the HOA's warning letter, I realized Karen wasn't just trying to be a nuisance. She was actively plotting to push Max and me out of the neighborhood. And if I didn't act quickly, the HOA would escalate. So, when I got the notice about an upcoming HOA meeting, I knew it would be my chance to hear exactly what Karen had in mind. The meetings were usually quiet affairs, attended by only a handful of homeowners. But this time, the community room was packed. Word had spread about the dog disturbance, and curiosity had pulled in people who normally didn't bother with HOA politics. Some came out of boredom, some came out of loyalty to Karen, and a few came just to see the drama unfold. Karen walked in with the same smug confidence she always carried. Her hair was perfectly styled, her folder of documents clutched tightly against her chest, like she was about to present evidence in a courtroom. She sat near the front, close to the board members, and cast a few self-satisfied glances around the room. To her, this was already a victory parade. The meeting started as usual with discussions about landscaping contracts and parking enforcement. But soon enough, the board chair shifted to the next agenda item: Complaints regarding pets. And there it was, my case. Karen immediately jumped up, wasting no time in making herself the center of attention. She launched into a dramatic speech about how the peace and harmony of the neighborhood were being destroyed by a certain dog. She painted Max as a nuisance, claiming he barked at all hours, frightened children, and created a sense of danger in the community. Her tone was polished, rehearsed, almost theatrical. As I sat there listening, I couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and disbelief. Every word she said was a lie, twisted and exaggerated to make Max seem like a menace. I knew the truth. Max was gentle, loved by everyone who had ever met him, and hardly the type of dog to terrorize anyone. But Karen was clever. She spoke with authority, leaning on her position as a board member, and for a moment I could see some neighbors nodding along. When it was finally my turn to speak, I calmly explained who Max really was. I described his temperament, his behavior, and how I had never received a single direct complaint from anyone in the neighborhood. I reminded the room that no one, not a single neighbor, had ever approached me with concerns. The only complaint had come through official channels, which conveniently traced back to Karen. Some people listened. Some seemed persuaded, but others looked conflicted. Karen had spent years cultivating her reputation as the watchdog of the neighborhood. To many, her word carried weight. If she said something was a problem, people believed her. Still, there were cracks in her performance. A few residents whispered to each other, casting skeptical glances in Karen's direction. They knew Max. They had seen him in the park, happily chasing tennis balls and playing with kids. He wasn't the monster Karen was describing. Sensing doubt in the room, Karen doubled down. She pulled out a sheet of paper from her folder, waving it like a weapon. She claimed she had records of incidents involving Max. Supposedly, multiple complaints had been submitted, all detailing the same disturbances. The board leaned forward, intrigued. But here's where Karen made her first mistake. In her eagerness to bury me, she overplayed her hand. The complaints she presented weren't signed, weren't dated, and looked suspiciously similar in wording. In fact, they looked like they had all been written by the same person. The board took the papers, glanced at them, and quietly set them aside. But the damage to her credibility was done. People noticed. Whispers grew louder. I could feel momentum shifting. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was the beginning of doubt. Karen had tried to frame me with forged complaints, and while she thought she was being clever, she had only planted seeds of suspicion about her own behavior. The board decided to investigate further. They announced they would review the situation, gather actual testimonies from neighbors, and revisit the issue at the next meeting. For now, Max and I were safe. No fines, no threats of removal, just a promise of further review. Karen did not take that well. As the meeting wrapped up, her frustration was written all over her face. She had expected to win easily, to have the board back her up and force me into submission. Instead, her plan had stalled, and worse, people were beginning to question her integrity. But here's the thing about people like Karen. They don't back down when things don't go their way. They push harder. They scheme more. They look for another angle. And I could see it in her eyes as she left that room. Karen wasn't finished with me. Not by a long shot. What Karen didn't realize, though, was that her own house wasn't as spotless as she pretended. Behind her manicured hedges, behind her carefully crafted image as the neighborhood's moral authority, Karen was hiding a violation of her own. A violation that, once discovered, would make all her complaints against me collapse in spectacular fashion. At that moment, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what secret she was hiding. But I knew one thing. Karen had just declared war. And in wars, secrets don't stay buried forever. The week following the HOA meeting was quiet at first, almost deceptively so. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to think maybe Karen had given up. Maybe the board's hesitation had convinced her to back down. But anyone who has ever lived next to someone like Karen knows silence is never surrender. Silence is planning. And sure enough, the storm came quickly. It started with petty harassment. I noticed anonymous notes left on my doorstep, poorly written complaints about Max barking too much or making the street unsafe. The handwriting was shaky, but the tone was unmistakable. They read more like personal jabs than official complaints, dripping with passive-aggressive venom. I knew immediately who was behind them. Then came the calls. Twice, I had local animal control officers show up at my house, claiming they had received reports of a dangerous dog on the property. Each time, the officers arrived, inspected Max, and quickly realized there was no issue. Max wagged his tail, licked their hands, and rolled over for belly rubs. The officers apologized, but they admitted they had to respond to every call. Someone was wasting their time, and I didn't need to guess who. But Karen wasn't satisfied with harassment alone. She wanted proof. She began patrolling the neighborhood with her phone out, filming Max whenever he stepped outside. If he barked, once at a passing squirrel, she zoomed in dramatically, as though she'd captured evidence of a crime. Neighbors started to notice her obsession. Some shook their heads, others chuckled at the absurdity, but Karen didn't care. She was determined to build her case, no matter how ridiculous it made her look. Despite her efforts, support for her crusade wasn't spreading the way she wanted. Most neighbors knew Max and liked him. Kids in the area often came by to pet him, and other dog owners appreciated having him around during walks. Karen's accusations just didn't line up with reality. That disconnect started raising quiet questions among residents. Why was she pushing so hard? Why was she the only one who seemed to have a problem? And then, almost by accident, a clue about Karen's own secret emerged. One evening, I was walking Max past Karen's property when I heard a strange noise coming from her backyard. It was a low, mechanical hum, something like an air conditioning unit, but louder, irregular. At first I thought nothing of it, but over the next few days I kept hearing it. Not just once or twice, but constantly, at odd hours. I wasn't the only one who noticed. A couple of neighbors mentioned it casually, wondering aloud why Karen's backyard always sounded like a small generator was running. Some speculated she had installed some fancy new landscaping equipment. Others joked about her building a bunker. Nobody knew for sure, but it was strange enough to get people talking. Then came another oddity. On trash day, Karen's bins were heavier than normal, overflowing with unusual bags filled with soil, plant matter, and large plastic containers. One neighbor commented how odd it was for someone so particular about appearances to be sneaking out bulky trash bags in the early morning, long before the collection trucks arrived. Alone, these details didn't mean much, but together, they painted a picture of something unusual happening behind Karen's perfect white fence. Something she clearly didn't want others to see. Meanwhile, Karen's campaign against Max only grew louder. She filed another round of official complaints with the HOA, citing the same supposed disturbances. This time, however, the board wasn't as quick to act. They had received pushback from neighbors who defended Max, and the forged complaint forms from the last meeting had left a sour taste in their mouths. They promised to review the situation, but the enthusiasm Karen once enjoyed from the board was fading. That only made her more desperate. She started spreading rumors, whispering to neighbors that Max had bitten someone, that I was violating leash laws, that I was secretly breeding dogs on my property. None of it was true, but in Karen's mind, truth wasn't necessary. If she repeated something enough, maybe it would stick. But the more she pushed, the more she drew attention. Not to Max, but to herself. Neighbors started comparing notes, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Karen was behind the anonymous notes. Karen was the one calling animal control. Karen was the one exaggerating every incident into a crisis. And with that attention came curiosity. People who had never cared about Karen's life before suddenly found themselves wondering, why was she so determined to attack someone else? What was going on in her own home that she was trying so hard to distract from? As whispers about the strange noises and suspicious trash grew, the seeds of doubt turned into suspicion. Karen had always been the one enforcing the rules, pointing fingers at everyone else. But now, for the first time, the neighborhood was beginning to point fingers back at her. For me, the harassment was exhausting, but I knew patience would be my best weapon. If Karen wanted to drag Max and me into the spotlight, so be it. Because sooner or later, the spotlight was going to swing back around to her. And when it did, it would reveal far more than she ever wanted the neighborhood, or the HOA, to see. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, Karen's war against Max had lost much of its momentum. The board, once quick to respond to her complaints, had grown noticeably hesitant. Neighbors who once quietly accepted her authority were now watching her with suspicion, and whispers about the strange happenings at her property were spreading, faster than she could control. The pressure was beginning to show. Karen, who normally prided herself on her flawless presentation, appeared at the meeting looking flustered. Her hair was a little out of place, her tone sharper than usual, and her folder of evidence thicker than before. She clearly believed the more papers she brought, the stronger her case would appear. But the truth was, the neighborhood wasn't as convinced as it once had been. That night, she launched into her usual speech about Max being a danger, but the energy in the room had shifted. Instead of nodding in agreement, people exchanged skeptical looks. Instead of supporting her claims, the board pressed her for details. Real details, not just vague accusations or conveniently anonymous statements. And that's when the first real crack in her perfect image appeared. One of the board members mentioned receiving multiple comments about unusual noises and activities around Karen's property. They didn't accuse her outright, but the implication hung heavy in the air. The very authority she had weaponized against me was now being turned back on her. Suddenly, Karen was the one under scrutiny. She brushed it off, insisting there was nothing unusual, that people were just misinterpreting harmless household projects. But the unease was obvious. The more she deflected, the more she looked guilty. Neighbors murmured quietly, exchanging knowing glances. Then, a few days later, the situation escalated. One of my neighbors, curious about the constant hum from Karen's backyard, decided to investigate. He lived directly behind her and had a clear vantage point over her fence. From his second-floor window, he could see into the yard, and what he saw left him stunned. There, tucked away in a corner, was a large, makeshift shed that Karen had never disclosed to the HOA. It wasn't a small storage unit or a gardening shed. It was far larger, outfitted with vents, lights, and electrical cables snaking across the ground. At night, the shed glowed faintly, the windows covered but leaking enough light to catch attention. It was clearly more than just a simple outbuilding. Word spread quickly. Soon, half the neighborhood knew about the mysterious shed. Some speculated it was an illegal greenhouse. Others joked about Karen secretly running a small factory. The truth wasn't clear yet, but one thing was undeniable. Whatever she was doing back there, she hadn't gotten HOA approval. And if there was one thing Karen had enforced relentlessly over the years, it was the rule that every structure, every addition, and every project required approval. The hypocrisy was staggering. For years she had bullied neighbors for minor violations: an unapproved paint color, a mailbox slightly out of spec, a garden bed installed without paperwork. Yet here she was, hiding a massive, unauthorized shed in her backyard. At the next HOA meeting, the discovery came to light. The neighbor who spotted the shed didn't stay silent. He stood up, described exactly what he saw, and challenged the board to explain why Karen's violation was being ignored while others were punished for far less. The room erupted. Some gasped, others muttered angrily, and the board members looked visibly uncomfortable. Karen tried to deny it, insisting it was just a small storage unit and perfectly within the rules. But too many people had seen it by now. Too many. Neighbors had noticed the lights, the noise, the strange trash bags. The board announced they would conduct a formal inspection, and in that moment, the balance of power shifted completely. For the first time, Karen was no longer the enforcer. She was the accused. After the meeting, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Everyone speculated about what Karen was hiding in that shed. Some thought it was an illegal business. Others whispered about more scandalous theories. Whatever it was, people were eager to see her exposed. For me, the irony was almost too perfect. Here was Karen, the woman who had tried so hard to get Max banned for being a nuisance, now facing scrutiny for breaking the very rules she had built her reputation on. But Karen wasn't done fighting. She knew her image was crumbling, and she was desperate to regain control. In the days leading up to the inspection, she doubled down on her attacks against me, trying to shift the spotlight back onto Max. She sent out new flyers accusing me of neglect, warning parents to protect their children from my dog. She even staged incidents, lingering near my yard with her phone, hoping to catch Max barking at nothing. But it was too late. The neighborhood's eyes were no longer on me. They were on her. And as the HOA prepared to investigate her property, Karen's carefully constructed facade was about to come crashing down. Because the shed was only the beginning. What the HOA would discover inside would make every complaint she had ever filed against me look petty and insignificant. And once the truth came out, Karen's reign over the neighborhood would be finished for good. The day of the inspection arrived with an unusual electricity in the air. The neighborhood had grown restless, buzzing with curiosity, waiting for the moment when Karen's fortress of control would finally be breached. For years, she had dictated how everyone else lived, enforcing rules with an iron grip. Now, the same rules she had weaponized against others were turning against her. The HOA board scheduled the inspection for a Saturday morning. That alone drew attention, since most inspections were handled quietly on weekdays, away from prying eyes. But Karen's case had become anything but quiet. By the time the board members and their compliance officer showed up, more than a dozen neighbors had gathered nearby, pretending to do yard work or walk their dogs, all of them eager to witness what would unfold. Karen, of course, tried to present herself as calm and collected. She greeted the board members with her usual forced politeness, insisting that the inspection was unnecessary and that everything on her property was in full compliance. But her voice had an edge to it, a nervous crack that betrayed the anxiety beneath her rehearsed exterior. When the board entered her backyard, the truth was impossible to deny. The shed loomed large, far bigger than anything allowed by HOA regulations. Its walls were reinforced, its vents humming with machinery, and electrical cords were draped like vines across the ground. The compliance officer's clipboard filled quickly with notes as he measured dimensions, documented power sources, and photographed the structure from multiple angles. But the size of the shed wasn't the most damning discovery. When the board asked Karen to open it, her hesitation was immediate. She stalled, claiming she had misplaced the key. Then she claimed it was just storage, filled with personal items that didn't concern the HOA. But the rules were clear. Any structure, any modification, and any usage on a property had to be disclosed and approved. The board insisted. Finally, under pressure and with the neighbors whispering loudly from beyond the fence, Karen relented. She unlocked the shed and swung the door open. The sight inside was nothing short of shocking. Rows of industrial grow, lights buzzed overhead, illuminating racks of plants. Dozens upon dozens of them cultivated with precision. Bags of fertilizer and soil lined the walls, alongside irrigation systems and electrical timers. It was clear that Karen had been running, An elaborate, unauthorized greenhouse operation right in the middle of the neighborhood. The irony was staggering. For years, she had demanded that neighbors cut their grass to exact lengths, filed complaints over garden decorations, and fined families for minor landscaping violations. Yet here she was, running what looked like a small-scale commercial grow operation, without permits, without approval, and in direct violation of the very bylaws she had enforced so viciously. The board members were stunned. The compliance officer photographed everything meticulously, recording every violation: unapproved construction, misuse of property, unauthorized electrical modifications, and potential safety hazards. The list grew longer with every minute spent inside the shed. Meanwhile, the neighbors outside were buzzing with disbelief. Word spread like wildfire. By the time the inspection ended, nearly the whole street knew about Karen's secret. People shook their heads in amazement. Some laughed outright, and others expressed anger. Many had been fined or reprimanded by Karen in the past for trivial infractions. Now they realized she had been breaking the rules all along. Karen, desperate to salvage her reputation, tried to spin the discovery. She claimed the greenhouse was a personal hobby, something harmless, something she didn't think required approval. But nobody was buying it. The sheer scale of the operation made her excuses fall flat. And worse, the timing couldn't have been more humiliating. She had spent weeks trying to get Max banned for being a supposed disturbance, all while hiding the biggest violation in the neighborhood. The HOA board made it clear. This was a serious offense. An emergency session would be scheduled to determine penalties, and Karen could be facing massive fines, forced removal of the shed, and possibly even expulsion from the board itself. For someone who had built her identity around being the enforcer of rules, this was a devastating blow. But Karen's problems were only just beginning. Later that week, the city inspector was called in. The HOA had no choice. What they found in her backyard wasn't just an HOA violation, it was a potential code and zoning violation as well. Electrical modifications without permits posed fire risks, and the scale of her greenhouse suggested she might have been selling plants illegally, turning her property into an unlicensed business. The city inspection confirmed the worst. Not only had she violated HOA bylaws, but she had also broken multiple city ordinances. The fines wouldn't just be hefty. They could bankrupt her if enforced fully. The neighborhood erupted in quiet celebration. For years, Karen had been untouchable, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Now, her empire was crumbling. The same people she had once lorded over were now reveling in her downfall. For me, it was poetic justice. She had tried to take Max away from me, tried to label him a menace, tried to turn the neighborhood against us. Yet here she was, exposed, as the true violator, the one who had endangered the community with her reckless and selfish actions. But as satisfying as the inspection was, it wasn't the end. The board still had to decide her fate officially. And knowing Karen, she wouldn't go down quietly. She would fight, argue, and claw at every shred of power she had left. The final showdown was coming. The meeting where the HOA would deliver its judgment, and the whole neighborhood would be watching to see whether Karen would finally face the consequences she had so eagerly imposed on everyone else. The days following the inspection were some of the most tense and dramatic the neighborhood had ever seen. For years, Karen had been untouchable, an authority figure who ruled over everyone else with confidence, rules, and fines. Now, her reputation lay in tatters, and her fate rested in the hands of the very HOA board she once controlled. The emergency session was scheduled for the following week. By then, the gossip had spread far beyond our street. Everyone in the neighborhood knew the details: the illegal shed, the unapproved construction, the city violations, and the potential fines that could cripple her financially. Neighbors who had once feared her now spoke openly about her downfall, recounting their own past run-ins with her. Every story painted the same picture: a woman who had overstepped her role for too long. When the night of the meeting arrived, the community hall was more crowded than ever before. People who had skipped meetings for years showed up just to witness the outcome. The air buzzed with anticipation, and for once, the focus wasn't on petty landscaping rules or parking disputes. It was about Karen. She entered the room with her head held high, but her confidence was cracked. Her usual air of superiority had been replaced by a nervous tension. She clutched her folders of papers as if they might save her, but even she must have known the tide had turned. The board began the session by laying out the findings of both the HOA inspection and the city inspection. The violations were read aloud one by one. Unapproved construction, unlicensed electrical work, unauthorized commercial activity, improper waste disposal, and multiple counts of breaking HOA bylaws. With every violation listed, Karen's shoulders stiffened, her jaw tightened, and the murmurs in the room grew louder. Then came the testimonies. Neighbors recounted the strange noises from her backyard, the suspicious trash bags, the constant harassment they had endured from her over the years. Some even admitted they had been too afraid to speak out before, fearing retaliation from Karen. But now, with her power slipping, they felt emboldened to finally tell the truth. For me, the moment was surreal. I sat there quietly, Max resting, peacefully at home, while Karen faced the judgment she had tried to bring down on me. I thought about the animal control visits, the anonymous notes, the false accusations she had hurled at my dog, and now she was the one being exposed as the real threat to the community. The board deliberated, but the outcome was inevitable. They announced their decision with firm finality. Karen was to be removed from the HOA board immediately. She would be fined heavily for each violation, required to dismantle the illegal shed at her own expense, and reported to the city for additional penalties. Her reign as the enforcer of the neighborhood was officially over. The room erupted in whispers and quiet applause. For the first time in years, people felt free. Free from her constant scrutiny, her endless complaints, her power-hungry grasp on the community. The board's decision was more than just a punishment for Karen. It was a statement that no one, not even the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, was above the rules. Karen, however, did not take it gracefully. She tried to argue, tried to defend herself, even tried to redirect the focus back onto me and Max. But the board wasn't interested. The evidence was overwhelming, and the community's patience had run out. Her words carried no weight anymore. She left the meeting in a huff, her face flushed with anger and humiliation, but the neighborhood knew she was finished. In the weeks that followed, the changes were immediate. The shed came down piece by piece, under the supervision of city officials. The loud humming that had once filled the air disappeared, replaced by the ordinary quiet of suburban life. For the first time in a long while, people felt at ease in their own homes, no longer afraid of being targeted for the smallest infraction. As for me and Max, the turnaround was remarkable. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now greeted us warmly, offering pats and treats for Max on our walks. Children who had heard Karen's rumors about him now played with him freely, laughing as he chased after their balls and wagged his tail. The very dog she had tried to label as dangerous had become something of a neighborhood mascot, a symbol of resilience against Karen's tyranny. And while Karen still lived in the neighborhood, she was a shadow of her former self. No longer on, the board no longer feared. She retreated into her home, her interactions with others minimal. The power she once wielded so recklessly was gone, and all that remained was the memory of her downfall. For me, the experience was a reminder of something simple yet powerful. Bullies only thrive as long as people let them. Karen had controlled the neighborhood for years, not because she was right, but because people were too afraid to stand up to her. The moment her own hypocrisy was exposed, the moment the truth came to light, her empire crumbled. Max, my loyal, golden retriever had been the catalyst for it all. In trying to take him away from me, Karen had revealed her true nature, and in the end, it was Max's wagging tail and gentle nature that united the neighborhood against her. The story spread beyond our block, shared as both a cautionary tale and a satisfying piece of poetic justice. Karen had called the HOA on my dog, but in doing so, she had exposed her own secrets, and in the end, the HOA had no choice but to punish her. Justice had been served, not just for me, but for the entire community. And as I watched Max chase after a tennis ball in the yard, his fur glowing in the afternoon sun, I couldn't help but smile. The neighborhood finally belonged to the people again. Not to Karen, not to her rules, but to the families who lived there, free at last from her shadow.